Do you guys want to talk about how you've used Coherent Body in terms of with boundaries?
The two main things I do with people are the three keys, the sensing posture and the infinity resolution, which is what Sue was talking about, that moment when you're taking the step forward and the uncertainty is there, right? What I've found with people is as I work with them on that, they're more comfortable in themselves, right? So they're the setting the boundary seems less risky, right? And I'm thinking too of something that Linda was sharing of like that feistiness that comes up, that the willingness to rock the boat. I find as people do these things, we're not even necessarily thinking about boundaries in session. We're not thinking about healthy expressions of anger or sticking up for yourself. But in practicing the sensing posture, in practicing infinity resolution, my clients come in then, a week or two later and they say, all of a sudden, like I'm doing this and like, what's going on? Right. So I see this progression kind of naturally happening as you find your sensing posture, as you find the capacity within yourself to move away from center and know you can return to it. My clients' voices are emerging more spontaneously, more naturally, and that leads to healthy boundary setting.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's great. The idea of spontaneity and authenticity. When you have that midline, you have a reference point. So the communication and reaching out or connecting to unknown outcomes, like when you're speaking your mind, the outcome is unknown. You have no control over that to be able to be centered, because if you are attached to the response and you want a certain response from other people, you could be really disappointed, but you need to be speaking from your center and core, and it would just come out effortlessly and in a way that you stay contained with it. Anyone else have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, there's this old Zen saying that I love: when the wrong person uses the right means work the wrong way. And so often we think about boundaries as, the advice of, well, be more assertive or tell them no, and that's the means. And what this work is trying to access is the how. So the stance that you take, right? Feeling your ground, feeling your center, your midline, that's being the person from which those means are generated. So if you're feeling your power, if you're feeling your core and you're connected to yourself, those means become more available. And that without that grounding in that, it can become performative.
Mhm.
Exactly. That's exactly how I felt that if I set a boundary, it was done very performatively, whereas now when I set a boundary, it's for me.
Hmm.
Wanted to share about working with Coherent Body, mainly the infinity resolution technique, with a couple. And it wasn't, so I've used it in similar ways with individual clients, as that's been described and seen. Whereas before, perhaps I was in more of a coaching role with clients around what it looks like to be putting boundaries in, like actually what's happening automatically without as necessarily, like Dave said, talking about it. But with a couple, it's different because you're not really working so much with the they've not come necessarily to talk about themselves. They come to talk about the relationship. And I had a couple that I was working with that I was really struggling with how they were stuck. They were at loggerheads about a particular issue. And I remember just being in this kind of stuckness, feeling this stuckness and just being like, okay, I feel really, really stuck. So I actually did I hadn't done it before with them. I did the three keys with them. It brought the energy right down. I felt like that actually what straight away happened because they were working with themselves in the space. The energy just dropped and they came into themselves. So all of a sudden I felt like there was some openness. And then I did the infinity resolution, which is whereby Sue will obviously explain it better, but you basically come up with you resource yourself on your left hand side with a deeply resourcing memory, and you tap that in, and then you bring in the issue that's challenging. And so I used the issue that they were stuck with, that they both did this. And it was really remarkable how then we were able to revisit the issue and actually be much more in our present selves. So what happened was they were able to come out of this deep reactivity that they were caught in with an issue that had been going on for years for them. And by coming from the body outwards through the practices, we got there in the session. that was like really mind-opening for me.
Yeah, that's really fun, because if you think about it, a lot of the conversations online, they're disembodied, and the way we're so polarized right now, that first step was coming into yourself. And people are avoidant. That's why they are compulsively keeping themselves busy, or compulsively scrolling, or trying to be still and to be present can be a very painful thing. And that's what the standing meditation is about. And that's why I do the work in standing, not in lying down, because you don't meet your stressors lying down. Well, sometimes it can be activating depending on your trauma, but for most people, that interaction of expressing what's happening inside of me right now, because a lot of times we don't know, we can't word it. And then how can I express it in a way that feels authentic and available? It's open. It's not like I'm saying it to win a point. So,
And just
yeah.
what was interesting with these two people, and somebody had put a message about how to work with people in overwhelm, or how to work with people in high agitation. They were doing different things. This is one of the challenges of their relationship, was that under threat, one of them would do deep avoidance and one would do deep anxiety and attack. And so they were in different states in their nervous system. And traditionally before, that's been a real challenge to work when you've got one that's very shut down and freeze and the other that's maybe in attack. And to bring the other one up so that they can meet, somewhere in adult regulation. And they were both doing those classics. So one was very, very overwhelmed, going towards a shutdown. The other was getting more agitated. And that the same process with them brought their nervous systems into the balancing, that brought them into connection, which I can't think of another technique that I could use that would do that. So normally I'd have to work with one to upregulate them and one to calm them down, but actually just through the three keys, their body went towards the coherence it needed. There was some upregulation for the overwhelm, and there was some downregulation for the agitation.
Yeah, really powerful, because what you're speaking to right there is like you're working with their human system, their body system, not their story system, not their individuality, not their ego states, not their identity, all the way down to what they share, which is their humanity. And when you are in a group setting and everyone can go down to what they share, and you have that common ground, literally, the common ground is the earth. The common ground is gravity as we're standing. It is a really inviting and enriched field that you create. So if any of you are out there and you work with groups, particularly young people or at-risk populations, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you and maybe talk about how you can use this work with those populations. So little can change so much when people have a very complicated life situation where there's trauma and addiction and abuse and poverty and all those things, and very little can go a long way. Something as simple as learning how to stand, really, really available to them.
That reminds me of Catalina's question earlier about the subjectivity and the objectivity, right? The subjectivity of our stories. And as you're speaking, Sue and Joe, like I'm thinking about, it's both are real, right? We all have our subjective experience, that we're in it, right? Like I can't get outside of my subjective experience, but that doesn't mean there's nothing outside of my subjective experience that's real. And when Sue's talking about the common ground, like we're all standing on the same planet. It's pulling all of us towards the center. That's real. It's really real. And in our minds, we can create anything. I mean, think of your favorite novel, right? It's a made up world that makes sense, and you can imagine it and you can feel and you can be within it. But that's different than gravity. That's different than metabolic processes. That's different than these things that are really happening. Connecting with those, I think, just is very, very unifying to be able to come back to what's happening in the here and now, and our shared experience in the moment is grounding.
Linda, can you speak to the EMDR experience?
Yeah, I was trained in EMDR in 1997, so it's been a long, long time, and I use it quite extensively. For a lot of people, using EMDR, I'd hear a lot of people say they had hangovers from it, that they couldn't find enough resource to be able to balance that hangover. I sometimes likened EMDR to a sledgehammer because it really knocked people off center quite quickly. And if they didn't have enough resource, it took them a long time to recover. And a lot of people started not wanting to do EMDR because of that. And so in Coherent Body, it feels like that mechanism in EMDR of the bilateral movement, it is naturally in our body. And what Coherent Body is doing is capturing that bilateral movement with center. And EMDR was bilateral movement, either with eyes, with tapping, with hearing, but it didn't really emphasize the midline. We were crossing the midline, but it didn't take into account what happens to those people who don't have a strong midline. And I think that's where EMDR maybe isn't developed enough or known enough. At least that's just my educated guess after doing Coherent Body. And so it has the similarities of bilateral, but it doesn't have the finesse of having your resource right at hand, not only your skeleton, but gravity. Um, and without a strong midline, doing that bilateral kind of work is very destabilizing. And it's hard to find center when you don't have a center to begin with. So when I moved to Coherent Body, I found it to be much gentler and, in a way, safer for people to use, because once you help them to find their three keys and find gravity, they always had that as a resource, no matter what else was going on. So if they started to go too much off of center, we just returned back to the three keys and gravity. And it's so much tangible for people to hang on to than trying to pretend that they have a safe place where maybe in their lives they've never experienced a safe place before. I found Coherent Body to be much more effective and much gentler, and at the same time going much deeper than I ever expected.
And from what you had told me, one of the problems was the activation when people would try to find resource, because
Yes,
it's story-based.
yes.
And it's personal. And what we're doing is we're trying to, if your personal story is traumatized, it's really hard to visit memories and find resourceful examples. If you drop below the story and you go
Yes.
into the template of a human system and you find that internal hydraulic support that you could breathe into, the elastic breath. So these are all concepts from the book, that you can stand on your own 2 feet, that you have this central column of support called the elastic breath, that you can access your power quite simply without straining. And that is your sensing posture, that standing. All of these things can happen when you have the right training, the right tools. And it, I've sold over 20,000 books that people can do it. Some people get confused a little bit with one thing here and there, but you feel the difference. And you felt the difference. I mean, for those of you attending and maybe those of you who are watching on the recording, that just doing some of these simple things that we've done in these 2 days can show you the power of shift that can be palpable. And what we're looking to do is have all of these experience settle into a system that recognizes its center line, that recognizes that place of self-support. Sometimes you need to co-regulate, you need the transference, you need to have that reparenting experience with another. But ultimately, you do need to find that self-support. And that's what we're looking, that's the core of this. Some people, if they need that level and a lot of safety, then there are ways to do that. This body of work is about ultimately finding that self-support in a healthy, opening way that allows you to be authentic, spontaneous.
And I think that's a really important part of that. For me, Coherent Body was this missing piece, because I still felt, even though I could have significant change within my therapy sessions, to get people up on their own feet in a, as therapists, our job is to get people to leave us, to people to feel safe enough that they can leave and be in the world. And to have a somatic practice that was really, really deeply about the person themselves doing it, rather than needing quite complex interventions by the therapist, or that to have that alongside, and in a way that can keep you quite tied into the relationship. Now, I mean, I deeply believe in the relationship. I know that the relationship is so deeply powerful in the way that I'm talking about. But fundamentally, the quicker people can start to feel that agency and that autonomy, then the quicker the work together can be as well.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, because Catalina had a question about integration, and I think what we're talking about is about integration of how you take these patterns, and if you can, what is integration is these global organizations of how you move through the world and how that bodily know-how of how I can act in these fundamental ways is integrating. I think we integrate through movement, and thinking's a part of it. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what integration means as a kind of thinking process rather than integration in that organismic know-how.
Yeah, like you're doing this all day long. You're standing all day long. You're feeling your elastic breath all day long. And it doesn't mean that you hold everything in your conscious thinking all the time, that you have a toolkit that you can pull and apply spontaneously, and you'll get better at that as you develop that skill. And one of the things that Erin, you mentioned, I think in one of our sessions, was really great was when you have this experience of like a deep fundamental change within yourself, when you don't mark it consciously, it can just disappear. And so one way you can mark it consciously is say, okay, I feel really different now. How would this state of myself, how would this person do what was difficult for you before? There are ways to use the whole of yourself as a stand-in for the whole of your pattern, basically. And there are different ways to look at it. There's a part in the program where you go through a writing process where you could identify patterns.
But just the integration piece for me, so I have a very core restless, I have had a real core restlessness in my system, which is a sort of flight energy. And with coherent body techniques, and I've had various different techniques I still use in grounding and breath and stuff, but with coherent body, I now can notice the restlessness and bring like 3 keys in, even sat in a session. I feel this opening expansion across my body, and there's an integration for me in that moment because I caught it. And that's how I see integration, is that there's the habitual busy, and here's the action, and here's the opening, and that's that conscious loop, like finishing the loop in a different way. So taking that restlessness and moving it into this openness instead of following the restlessness in the unconscious habitual way. So for me, the integration piece is this constantly bringing in the body alignment so that my body can go, oh, we don't have to keep doing that unfinished loop. We can do this one instead. Did that make sense?
And I think that a big piece of it, right, is that this actually works. This actually works in my life, right? That's the integration. I think, you can talk about something in therapy, you can experience regulation in therapy, but to actually have the embodied experience of a new mind body shape, if you want to use that word from yesterday, to experience that it actually works in your life from
And
an
like that.
eternal place, right?
Yeah.
That's the integration.
Yeah. Exactly. Thank you. That was what I was trying to say.
I think too, like there's a couple questions here on the EMDR. And Pam, you said that EMDR had helped you immensely with things. And I think what David, you said is important because we can resolve those things that happen to us, like the traumas through EMDR, but then it leaves you kind of open to, okay, that doesn't feel bad anymore. And I know I wasn't responsible for that anymore, but now what? And with Coherent Body, you have a now what, because you have this inner type of core now that wants to move forward. So you have more of a direction or a goal. And that too is part of the integration of healing. It's not just, okay, I feel better from that trauma and now I can go on with my life. Coherent Body doesn't stop there. It doesn't drop you there. It keeps you moving forward from, all right, now that piece is processed and we're moving on with the rest of our life. And how shall we move on with the rest of our lives? Will it still be in our trauma stories? Because there's always going to be another trauma story. And with Coherent Body, you have a choice on whether you want to move ahead and resolve another trauma story or moving ahead with your human story. And so the integration piece of that too is, are you integrating your human story into your life so that you can live it and move forward with it versus letting the baggage from the past just kind of drag you down?
You know, that reminds me of, I did this work called Continuum, and the founder, Emily Conrad, she worked with these undulating small movements, and she worked a lot with people who had spinal cord issues. So they're paralyzed to some extent, and she was helping them find these deep levels of movement and under, controlled settings. And one woman, though, she was a paraplegic, but she could start to move. And she said out loud, if I'm not a paraplegic, what am I? She didn't have a place to go with that. And the idea, especially for a lot of people who've been working for decades with their trauma, they become bonded to their own identity as broken or needing to be worked on, and it consumes a lot of time. And so when that level of work goes away, they're like, oh, what do I do with my time? And so that, to your point, that when you connect into your heart, because that's what we're looking to have you move forward, not just to move forward, but to something that is heart connected. Now the energy and excitement around moving forward is not around turning around and fixing the past, but it's around being connected to a deeper desire, using your innate creativity to create your life. Yeah,
And
no, go ahead.
Love that, Sue. Yeah, I want to cheer. I love that.
there's another EMDR question about after doing EMDR, you felt very open, Pam, and that a narcissistic person took advantage of that. And would that have happened with Coherent Body? Yes and no, or maybe, right? But I think, again, it's the same thing. EMDR can open you up and free you, but what's the next step? Yeah, are you still open to everything in the world? Are you still just as vulnerable? Are you still carrying the story that you carried into the EMDR session? That now that piece of it feels better, but there's it now leaves you back into the state of how you were before that trauma happened, which back then you might have been more open and trusting as well. And so then you find yourself back into that same position once that trauma is resolved. And that's why in Coherent Body, it gives you direction and goal and a drive to not stay in your story anymore. So when you're in your human story, you're so much in your body and present that the flags that we often miss when we're traumatized or dissociated are we're much more aware of those flags that would give us warning that we're walking into perhaps a narcissistic or dangerous situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Your boundaries become, they kind of emerge because your center clarifies.
Yes,
The centering's like you said, Linda, the centering's the difference from the
yes.
EMDR. Mm. Yeah. There was a question that Leslie asked actually after my talk about being witness. I just thought I could revisit it now. I think the question was about do we need to have the witnessing to complete the neural loops, the unprocessed arousal, and I deeply believe, and I've experienced it in therapy sessions, that telling your story, if you have an explicit memory of something that happened to you, then that telling the story of like, then this happened is an essential part of moving that energy through, and having somebody make sense of it with you is a really vital part. However, obviously, a lot of the stories from our, like as I was describing, the baby implicit memories is like we don't know what those stories were, and we form stories around what we think they are. And an example of that for me just recently has been a massive realization about my parents being very neurodiverse, and I've now got a completely different story about them to the one that I've been creating, because I thought that they were neglectful, and actually it was a huge level of neurodiversity. So it's just sort of opened up this whole story thing. So with the witnessing piece, this presence, which we can then start to do for ourselves, is where we can help with the neuroplasticity of the brain. So we do it with our therapists, with our close people that give us that safety. And I think humans are always going to need that kind of connection for sure. But the purpose of how I work, and Sue's work really helped me consolidate more, was that to create this inner witness where I could go, oh, I'm doing the restlessness. I know it's to do with this piece of trauma that I'm still processing. I don't need to keep saying that. I can just go into the 3 keys. And because I've coupled that now, that awareness of this particular somatic response needs me to do the 3 keys. And I usually do a bit of a hand on my heart and okay as well. So I couple it with that too. And so, yes, we do need the witnessing, and we can do that for ourselves.
That witnessing helps to train you so that you can internalize it. And sometimes there's no right or wrong or hard and fast rules. It's like, if you do need to reach out, reach out.
Yeah. Gonna say co-regulation, for an infant helps them learn self-regulation as they developmentally are able to do that, right? So the being witness develops the inner witness. And also all of us, like the world is bigger than any of us can hold on our own. And so being in community with others who can help us to see what we don't see, to help us witness what we're unable to witness, is also a part of it. It's not just either or, right? Like we need each other, and we also need to develop our own ability to know within ourselves.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. That's such a good point. And one of the reasons these therapists are here, because as I had people go through the program and experience these deep changes in their bodies, for me, it was all like one way. But there were people who were changing too fast and needed more holding. And I didn't feel like that was my role, or I was trained to do that. And that's why I found some therapists who have great training and are already body oriented and trained. And they are going to be part of the fundamentals library program now. So they'll be available if you want to hire them for one-on-one individual help sessions, because I think that could be really powerful. We got a chance to meet them and learn about their backgrounds. And when you go into a one-on-one relationship with a therapist, it's a long process. And when you're going through trying to find the right match, it also gets quite expensive. So here, if you come into the fundamentals program, you have the opportunity